birth. And they were comparing children who got it on the day of birth to children who got it within the first 60 days of life, comparing it to children who didn't get it. And they were looking at the health outcomes. And what they found was that children who got that vaccine had an 1,135% greater chance of having a autism diagnosis than kids who didn't get it. And they knew...
Sorry, 1,100%.
1,135%. So it's called a relative risk of 1,135. Just for comparison, the relative risk between smoking a pack of cigarettes a day for 20 years and getting lung cancer is 10. And that's causation. So they knew in 1999 what was causing the autism epidemic, and they had an emergency meeting when they got this study back. And they didn't do it on the CDC campus because they thought then they would have to give it to the public in the Freedom of Information law, and they wanted to keep it a secret. So they had a secret meeting at a retreat center in Norcross, Georgia, called the Simpsonwood Retreat Center, and they invited the heads of all the vaccine companies. There were 75 people at that meeting, all the regulators from the World Health Organization, the CDC, FDA, NIH. They all got together for 2 days, and they looked at this study, and they agreed to keep the study secret. But during that 2-day period, they spent the first day talking about this study and agreeing among themselves that it was true that they were destroying all these children. And they say these horrific things, like one of the leaders of the regulatory community says, my grandson was born this morning and I'm not going to get him vaccinated.
Lovely.
And then they spend the next day talking about how to keep this from the American public, how to hide it from the press, from lawyers, they're terrified of the lawyers. And they were very scared that they themselves would have liability. I think all of them, I think these impacts and what the science shows, all these impacts are cumulative. And our kids today are sick because we are bombarding their immune systems with these toxics that they simply cannot handle. Vaccines is part of that story. And it's probably, in my view, the largest single cause, although all of them are very big. Now, in 1999, CDC was also alarmed by the same thing that you described with the parents. So they decided to do an internal study of their own database, which is called the Vaccine Safety Data Link. It's the medical records, including the vaccination records, of 10 million kids from the 10 biggest HMOs. So it's all the cumulative medical records from all those HMOs, and they're all housed in one place. And they said, let's see if these Mercury vaccines are causing autism. So they looked at one vaccine. They can look at every vaccine record, and then they can look at your medical claims to see if you had seizure disorders or allergies, or if you have an autism diagnosis. They can do a cluster analysis, and they can look for associations. So they looked at the hepatitis B vaccine, which is loaded with mercury, during the first 30 days of life. They looked at kids who got it during the first 30 days. They compared them to kids who did not get it during the first 30 days, who got it later or didn't get it at all. And here's what they found. The relative risk of smoking a pack of cigarettes a day for 20 years and lung cancer is 10. This was 11.35.
Is that because of thimerosal?
What was causing from thimerosal? This is what the story that got me involved, because they pushed the panic button and they had a secret meeting. They didn't want to do it on the CDC campus because they thought it would be susceptible to Freedom of Information requests. So they did it in a remote Methodist retreat center on the banks of the Chattahoochee River in Norcross, Georgia. And it was called Simpsonwood. They had a 2-day meeting with 52 individuals, including all the major vaccine companies, regulatory agencies that administer vaccines, WHO, CDC, FDA, NIH, HHS, and the leaders, the leading academic vaccine
vaccinators, so the people who basically conduct clinical trials and make hundreds of millions of dollars for medical schools around this country. And the first day, and somebody, Megan, recorded that meeting. We don't know why. We don't know if they knew they were being recorded, but I got a hold of the transcripts in 2005, and it is horrific. It's a nightmare. Any of your listeners can go to our website, Children's Health Events, and read those transcripts and make up your own mind about what happened. And you see the pangerms of the American healthcare system, these regulators who are supposed to be protecting us. The first day, they're looking at the science and they are saying it's bulletproof. We are causing autism.
The government scientists are acknowledging that even tiny infinitesimal amounts of mercury, parts per billion, will cause profound neurological injury in children. And I was working on these issues, and mothers started coming up to me and said, you know, the biggest exposure is not coming from power plants or old mining claims, as you might think. It's coming from our own vaccines. And they asked me to work on it and just to look into it. And they were not hysterical people. They were scientists, they were doctors, they were psychiatrists, they were pharmacists, they were people who had their feet on the ground, they had attended the conferences, they had read the scientific literature, they had calmly and deliberately gone through this, and they had reached a conclusion. And the conclusion was that the vaccines were destroying the health, were making the sickest generation of American children in the history of our country. And I started looking into it, and somebody provided me with the Simpsonwood memo, which I then published in Rolling Stone. And Simpsonwood was the transcripts of a secret meeting that was held between CDC and 75 representatives of the vaccine industry, in which they reviewed a report that CDC had ordered, the Verstraeten study, of the 100,000 children in the United States Vaccine Safety Database. And when they looked at it themselves, they said, it is impossible, this is a quote, to massage this data to make the signal go away. There is no denying that there is a connection between autism and thimerosal and the vaccines. And they said, and this is what they said, I didn't say this. This is what their own scientists and their own conclusion of the best doctors, the top people at CDC, the top people at the pharmaceutical industry. And you know, when they had this meeting, they had it not in Atlanta, which was the headquarters of the CDC, but in Simpsonwood at a private conference center, because they believed that that would make them able to insulate themselves from requests under the Freedom of Information Law, and they would not have to disclose the transcripts of these meetings to the public. Somebody transcribed the meetings, and we were able to get a hold of it. But you have them talking about the Verstraeten study and saying there's a clear link, not just with autism, but with a whole range of neurological disorders. Speech delay, language delay, all kinds of learning disorders, ADD, hyperactivity disorder, and the injection of these vaccines. And they could tell because, as you know, the vaccine protocols were dramatically increased. When I was a little boy, we only got 3 vaccines. But my children, 5 of my 6 children, got 22 vaccines. Beginning in 1989, that's the thimerosal generation. That's the vaccine generation. And it's the sickest generation in the history of this country. And I looked at these, I read, and I was astonished. Because I have worked on environmental issues for 25 years. And I know what captive agency phenomena is. It's the dynamic by which the regulatory agencies become captured by the industries they're supposed to regulate. And there's all kinds of mechanisms that encourage that or provoke that or promote that to happen. But I was shocked because I know many of these people in CDC. And I know the people in the FDA. And I know that when they entered those agencies, they entered it with a good heart, intending to do the right thing. But something had corrupted them. They got sucked into a vortex because they made decisions that were wrong, and then instead of admitting it to the public, they covered it up to protect themselves. And it was very clear. And then I got a hold of the correspondence between the doctors and between CDC, rebuking each other and saying, why didn't we look at this? Why didn't somebody do a mass loading before we did approve these protocols with 22 vaccines to these children? Why didn't we do this? Rebuking themselves, rebuking each other. And then the Simpsonwood transcripts, after the first maybe 2 hours in which they are talking about the undeniability of the connection between autism and thimerosal, the impossibility of massaging the data further in order to try to eliminate those signals. That's what they spend the first 2 hours. The rest of the meeting they spend talking about how do we hide this from the press, from the public, and what they call the predatory bar. All the lawyers out there who may represent people who were injured by their negligence. And at the end of that meeting, they make a few decisions. One is for Stratton, the man who designed, who conducted the study, is hired the next day by GlaxoSmithKline and shipped off to Switzerland. And 6 months later, he sends in a redesigned study that includes cohorts that are predictably, who are too young to have been diagnosed as autistic. So he loads the study down, the data down, and they tell the public that they've lost all the original data. This is what CDC says to this day, that it does not know what happened to the original data in the Verstraeten study. And they published this other study it's a corrupt and crooked, what we call tobacco science, done by a bunch of biostitutes of crooked scientists who are trying to fool the American public. Then Kathleen Stratton from CDC and IOM says what we need is some studies that will disprove the link. So they work with the vaccine industry to gin up these 4 phony European studies that are done by vaccine industry employees, funded by the vaccine industry, and published in the American Academy of Pediatrics magazine, which receives 80% of its revenue from the vaccine industry. And none of these scientists disclose any of their myriad conflicts which conventional ethics rules require them to do. It's not disclosed. And these studies, and I've made a profession of reading phony science, of junk science, of tobacco science, because I see it every day. I've sued over 400 polluters, and this is how they defend themselves. They hire these phony scientists, tobacco scientists, they produce these phony reports, so I know how to read them. So I did something that not a single member, you see the press here and all there, not a single member of this press corps, I can guarantee you, has ever read any of those studies. It has not happened. What they read was the CDC's description of those studies, which has nothing to do with what's in the studies. And you need to read these studies, and I'm talking to you guys, and you need to read them critically. And that woman, I called that woman who wrote that Time magazine article. And I called the editor of the Washington Post when they said, this is the newest mythology. Well, they've removed the thimerosal from the vaccines, and autism rates have not gone down. How many times have you read that repeated by these people from the press? That is an industry talking point that the industry knows is a lie. Everybody knows that's a lie. The amount of thimerosal today in the flu vaccines is about 60% of what they claim to have removed from all the other pediatric vaccines. So I read these studies, and I saw studies that weren't even good for it. It wasn't even high quality fraud. It is low quality. These are low quality, the worst. Anybody, you don't even need a scientist to advise you and tell you where the fraud is. And I'll tell you what I'll just tell you one of them, the big one that they all rely on, the Danish study, where they said, okay, in 1992, Denmark banned thimerosal. And after that, autism rates continued to climb. Therefore, there is no association between autism and thimerosal. That's the study. What they didn't tell you is that in 1992, Denmark was concerned about the connection between thimerosal and autism and about this huge rise in autism, and it began for the first time registering autism as a reported illness in Denmark. So all the people who had autistic children suddenly had to register them for the first time. Plus, in Copenhagen, they founded a new clinic to treat autistic kids, which gave people a huge financial incentive and health incentive to register their children. So it was the registry that went up, not the incidence of autism that went up, but they didn't say that in the study. They never mentioned the Copenhagen clinic. They never mentioned the change in the rules in Denmark. They just show you the graphs of thimerosal is banned here and autism continues to go up. Well, the reason the autism rates rose was because it was an artifact of their data collection processes. It had nothing to do with the reality on the ground of the occurrence of autism. So, and you've heard all of their other studies, and they all have this guy, Paul Offit. You guys know him? And he is the poster child for the term biostitute. This is a man who has made himself the spokesperson for the vaccine industry. He portrays himself as an independent scientist. He doesn't disclose the millions of dollars that he does not disclose the millions of dollars of transactions. These people, one of the worst crimes that they've done. And I told the New York Times, I said, you guys had Judith Miller, for a year talking about the Iraq War and saying what a great thing it is and covering up all the truth from the government spokespeople. And I said, there's no difference what you're doing. And then you had to come out and apologize. And the Times publicly apologized for that. And I said, you're going to have to apologize for this someday, for what you've done here. Because what you've done here, that war is going to cost us $3 trillion. But the treatment of these children and the cost to our society from what you have done, what you are doing to this generation of children, is going to far exceed the cost of the Iraq War. And somebody is going to have to come to terms with that. And ultimately, the American press has completely let down our democracy. And one of the things you see repeated again and again is that that the women, who claim that their children, and I've gotten now hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of letters, and that's not hyperbole, it's not exaggeration, from women who have the exact same experience. They bring a perfectly healthy 2-year-old who's exceeded all of their milestones to a doctor who they trust to get their pediatric flu shots, their MMR vaccines at the age of 2. They get that shot, the child goes into seizure, develops a fever that night, and over the next 3 months loses her or his ability to speak, to interact with his brothers and sisters, engages in stereotypical behavior, headbanging, screaming, biting, and loses all capacity for social interaction. And they lost this child, and they watch it happen. And it's happened thousands and thousands of times. And you hear that story once or twice, and you say, well, maybe it's an anomaly. But you hear it 100 times, and you have to say, we got to start looking at this. Nobody on the CDC has said, no, we're not going to look at it. We're going to cut off all funds to anybody who wants to look at it. Why isn't the press asking that question? Why aren't they asking CDC, why don't you study the Amish like UPI did? Why don't you study these homeschooled kids? 30,000 homeschooled kids studied by the UPI and no autism in that group. They studied all the Amish in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. There should be 130 autistic kids. There are 4. And 3 of them were adopted after receiving their vaccines. And the 4th one lived downwind of a coal-burning power plant. So we know what the truth is. And what we've got to stop doing is blaming the mothers, which is what they've done. These are not hysterical women. These are people. I have a child who has allergies, profound allergies, life-threatening anaphylactic allergies, and asthma. My wife knows better than any doctor. She can put her hands on that boy, and she knows what's wrong with him. She knows if his chest is tightening up. She knows exactly what allergen triggered his allergy. She knows what's going wrong with that child. and these mothers know what made their child sick.